Welcome back to the Full View. Now, tension has escalated in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo ahead of the inauguration of President-elect Felix Tshisekedi. Opposition parties and presidential candidates have rejected the results, saying elections were a sham. SABC's Sophie Mukwena has more on the story.
It was supposed to be a new dawn in the DRC. However, some leaders in that country have described the recently concluded elections as lacking credibility ahead of the inauguration of the re-elected president. On Saturday, questions are being raised on the future of the DRC and peace in the Great Lakes region.
Because if you can't have an election in a big part of chunk of the country, such as Goma and those areas, my view is that then to what extent will the electoral outcome really be legitimate when a portion of the country is not having? Look at the situation in South Africa. If we were to suspend the elections of one province, let's say Limpopo or Free State, doesn't matter how big or small it is, and then we carry on, we have an election. Then 80% of the country has had election, 20% has not. What are we saying about democratic space? So my view is that the political culture and the topography is a problem.
During campaigning in Kinshasa last year ahead of the presidential and parliamentary elections in December, the leader declared war on neighboring Rwanda, accusing it of backing the M23 rebel group with resources to destabilize the DRC.
The rhetoric towards these elections, including by President Tshisekedi, sounded like he was beating the drums of war against the M23, against neighboring Rwanda, against other so-called rebels, and there are more than 120 in the eastern DRC alone. I think in his new tenure, it is no longer the time to have a sitting president declaring war on his subjects. And I don't think it is the time to say who is a Congolese and who is not. It would be a time, as I would be saying in my recommendations, to have an all-inclusive dialogue. And this is not new. We had a similar dialogue in 2001, 2002 that was promoted by the international community. So I think meaningful reconciliation would focus on building trust, and that is necessary for cooperation between individuals and communities, so that we don't have Ituri, North Kivu, South Kivu at war since time immemorial. This could be the time.
The United Nations peacekeeping mission is expected to pull out of the DRC by April. The DRC government has also ended the contract of the East African Community troops that were deployed in the eastern part of the country to bring peace and stability.
Just last week, Kenya and Tanzania were in a tit-for-tat of banning their flights. Uganda and Kenya are taking each other to some courts. Rwanda and Burundi are closing each other's borders. Rwanda and DRC have threatened each other's war. South Sudan is at war with itself. So the East African community at the moment, which is closest to DRC, is under some serious tensions, of which, while we are focusing on the East, on DRC, we also need to focus on how our regional groupings are operating.
SADC has since deployed troops in the DRC, and the M23 rebels have resumed fighting in the eastern part of that country. Sophie Mukwena, SABC News, Johannesburg.
And for more on this story, we cross live now to Chris Ochamringa in Kinshasa, DRC, who has been covering this story for us. Chris, a very good evening to you. Look, this inauguration comes at the time where the opposition have flat out rejected the results. What is the current mood ahead of the installation of the president?
The mood here is mixed. The supporters of President Felix Tshisekedi are very excited about this inauguration. they regard it as a historic occasion because the DRC has only had one peaceful transfer of power since it gained independence from Belgium in 1960. So this to them is a very big deal. But there are very many other people, especially the opposition members, who feel very sad. They describe this election in December as a sham, and they want it to be cancelled. They want fresh polls to be organized by a totally new team of electoral officials, something that the government has outrightly rejected. And so some of these opposition leaders have been calling on their supporters to take to the streets tomorrow. That's the day when the inauguration will happen, to kind of disrupt the celebration, the festivities, and also kind of force the government to hold fresh polls. But the government has said that it will deploy soldiers across the city and other parts of the country to break up any protest that happens. And so there are, according to the Electoral Commission, there were 18 million people who participated in this election. This is a country that has more than 100 million people. Very many people did not vote in this election, and those are the people who, are still waiting to see whether the president will really live up to the promises that he made during the electoral campaigns. Because the DRC is a country that has had a history of politicians making lots of promises, but not fulfilling them once they're in power. So people are very wary. They are waiting to see whether the president will be different in the next 5 years of his term.
And speaking of the president, I mean, Chris, the incoming president has ruffled some feathers in relation to the relationship with the East African countries. Any word from the EAC ahead of the inauguration tomorrow?
Well, the EAC Secretariat has congratulated President Felix Tshisekedi, and the DRC government invited some of these leaders from the region to come and witness this inauguration. We know the Vice President of Uganda is going to be here. I think a senior official from Tanzania will also be here, and the President of Kenya is expected to be here. So there seems to have patched up this strained relation, which was really caused by two things. One was the deployment of the East African Community Regional Force in Eastern DRC last year. The government had signed a deal known as the Status of Forces Agreement. Now, under that agreement, the forces from the East African Community were supposed to come and take over the areas where the M23 rebels were supposed to withdraw from. And the leaders from the East African Community had ordered all the rebels to withdraw from all the areas they had captured. There are more than 10 areas that they have captured in North Kivu province in the east. But these rebels did not leave some of these areas. So the government was saying, look, the heads of state from the East African Community had said if these rebels do not leave, then the East African troops would force them out by fighting them. So they were very disappointed that the fighting was not happening. The rebels were living side by side with these troops, and that is why they ordered them to leave last December. And the other reason why the strained relations is the former head of the DRC's Electoral Commission, Mr. Corneille Nangaa, went to Nairobi, the Kenyan capital, to launch a rebel movement that was working together with the M23 rebels to topple the government of President Felix Tshisekedi. That really angered authorities in Kinshasa. They recalled the ambassador to Kenya and Tanzania, and even refused to allow electoral observers from the East African Community to come here. So that is the reason of the tension between the two countries. We're waiting to see how it will play out after President Tshisekedi starts his new term.
And very quickly, Chris, before I let you go, speaking of troops that are pulling out, the UN peacekeepers will also be pulling out of the DRC. Talk to us about what kind of impact this will have on the security in the DRC.
Well, it will have a significant impact, especially in provinces like Ituri, which is very rich in gold and has very many rebel groups. North Kivu province, where the M23 are occupying a number of areas. The United Nations peacekeepers have been helping protecting some civilians who have been displaced by this conflict. Many civilians have gone and put up shelters near the camps, the bases of the United Nations peacekeepers, where they have been protected by these peacekeepers. So when they leave, there will be a vacuum. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DRC has assured the Congolese people that they're up to the task. They're going to ensure that they send troops to all those areas where the UN has been helping, to protect civilians after they leave at the end of this year. And so they're saying there's no reason to worry. They're going to ensure that they do everything possible. But the only difference is that, the United Nations is a multinational force. It has a lot of funding that comes consistently, and there are systems within the UN to ensure that issues of fraud, corruption do not happen. But the DRC doesn't have those systems. This country has had corruption for a very long, for very many years, and that is one of the reasons that has been keeping people in poverty and fueling the insecurity in the East. So we're hoping to see whether the government will really, plug all those loopholes and ensure that they offer supplies to their forces to be able to secure the areas in the east of the DRC that have had insecurity for almost 3 decades now.
Live from Kinshasa, that was SABC News correspondent Chris Ochamringa.